Charlie Ed was a defiant pachyderm. That defiance made him famous, and in the end, it killed the Asian elephant. Ed, as he was known, visited Cranbrook almost a century ago, the star of the Sells Floto Circus. The circus had 14 elephants in total, which toured North America alongside Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Ed was their leader, and his well-trained herd docile. Ed himself would dance the Charleston for paying customers. But something on a warm August day in 1926 spooked him as he was led out of a train's boxcar in Cranbrook. He sniffed the mountain air, and according to elephant wrangler Poodles Hannaford, Ed let blast a wild trumpet. Then he was gone. Ed was running from the circus, the 13 others in his herd right on his tail. Now you'd think it'd be easy to track an animal that weighs as much as a fully loaded SUV. But Ed was agile, and Asian elephants can run up to 40 kilometers an hour. 11 of Ed's breakout crew were brought in after having a raucous time in town, but 3 bolted for the surrounding mountains and stayed on the run for days, which then stretched to weeks. The story spread too, and the escapees became a worldwide sensation. After about 3 weeks, one elephant named Tilly was lured back into captivity with loaves of bread. A crowd assembled to witness the now famous outlaw being loaded into a boxcar. The second of the 3, Myrtle, survived in the bush a little longer, but by the time searchers found her, she was emaciated and acting erratically. She charged the trackers, who put her down out of compassion or fear. Myrtle's body was left to rot where she dropped. Her head was paraded through town before being sent to a museum. People were harsh a century ago. That left Ed, and he wasn't giving up easily. The searchers brought in Tunaha trackers who knew more about the surrounding forest than any settler, though finding an elephant was a unique endeavor. Tunaha guides tracked him to nearby Jim Smith Lake, which was logical since elephants drink as much as 200 liters of water a day. What Ed ate those 40 days in the bush, though, is anybody's guess. He was the smallest of the 3 escapees, but he put up the most ferocious fight. According to Poodles, Ed had fire in his eyes and trumpeted wildly before charging his captors again and again and again. Tunaha trackers fashioned a snare between 2 tamarack saplings like they would for a grizzly bear, and that did it. Ed was caught in a trap, and he couldn't walk out, and he was led back to town in chains. By then, Ed had tasted freedom. He'd grown wild again. He was so wild that they built a special train compartment for him so the other circus elephants couldn't see his disobedient ways. Cranbrook became momentarily famous and eventually commissioned a sculpture to the elephant who brought them all that attention. But Ed was wild now. He tasted freedom and wouldn't do the Charleston anymore. He was sold to another circus and then finally a zoo in San Francisco. But Ed remained uncontrollable and killed his zoo handler. He was executed by firing squad a decade after that wild romp through the Kootenay bush. Hi, I'm Mitchell Scott, editor-in-chief of Kootenay Mountain Culture magazine, and this is The Headwaters, brought to you by Columbia Basin Trust. On this podcast, we're going to tell you some tall tales. I mean, some real whoppers. If there's one thing we like to do here in the Kootenays, it's spin a yarn. So we're going to do just that. And we've got some beauties. Most of these stories are the absolute truth and nothing but the truth. Others, well, more than a grain of salt may be required. Our resident historian, Greg Nestoroff, is here to tell us this tall tale. Greg, this one is a gem, but I got to ask you, do you believe it?
Mitch, I don't, but generations of treasure hunters believed it. And this tall tale first appeared in the Nelson Tribune in the spring of 1894.
So it's true for sure. It was in a newspaper.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it was started by a guy named Randall Kemp. He was a journalist and a mining promoter and also a notorious tall tale teller.
So what story did he tell?
So Kemp wrote that he was out looking for lost cattle with two brothers, the Cockle brothers.
Love that name, too, the Cockle brothers.
And they are real. We know these guys actually existed. So this is back when there was a gold and silver rush going on in the West Kootenay, and people are streaming in from all over the world trying to make it rich. And someone had to feed these miners, so cattle were a precious commodity.
And the rancher had lost his cattle.
Yeah. So this trio, they were cruising the lake around Grey Creek in two boats looking for the cattle when they decided to pull into shore. So they got on shore and they climbed to the top of the hill to rest and have something to eat. I'm going to let 95-year-old Tom Limbury pick up the story from here. Tom is Mr. Grey Creek. He's in assisted living now, but he lived his entire life in Grey Creek, running the famous Grey Creek store that you might know.
You can buy anything at the Grey Creek store.
Absolutely. A chainsaw and a loaf of bread at the same time. So these three guys are up on this hill. They're overlooking the lake when one of them leans against a rock.
Found what seemed to be gold in it because his pick started to stick in the gold, and they eventually scraped around it, and they decided it was a actual chunk of real gold worth, at that time, $250 million or so, much more today, of course. So they debated as what to do, and they decided to come back the next day with some equipment.
What these three men claim they found was a gold boulder worth, by their estimation at the time, $250,000. So that would be roughly, $8 or $9 million in today's money.
Lots of money.
It would make them rich if they could get this gold boulder to nearby Crawford Bay. But they couldn't budget. Gold is soft, but it is really heavy. So, as Tom says, they decide to return the next day to winch this gold boulder down to a wooden boat.
And they set up a cribbing of some sort, and with a crowbar and other equipment, they managed, three of them managed to get it out onto the cribbing, and they started sliding it down to the boat below, and then the rope broke, and it fell through the boat into 250 feet of water. So that was the end of that at that point.
So wooden boat, giant boulder shatters boat, and boulder goes down to the depths of Kootenay Lake. Tragic story.
Yeah, a fortune down into the depths of a freezing cold lake. And Kemp writes in the Tribune what happened, and thus begins the legend of the gold boulder.
How extensive is the search?
Well, at first there isn't any because folks at that time, they don't believe Kemp. They recognize this is a far-fetched tale from a guy who is full of them. But then over the years, the story is resurrected, and in the 1960s, it's taken at face value.
Then what happens?
People start asking questions, and the search really begins.
Really?
Yeah.
In earnest?
Yeah, so a couple of guys, they're so serious about the gold boulder that they stake a claim over the alleged site.
Like over the lake.
Right
basically.
over the water. And they set up a mining company with the purpose of finding this boulder. And they build a platform over the site and search just about full time.
But they never get down to it. Because, again, if you don't know, Kootenay Lake is one of the deepest lakes in British Columbia.
Well, they claim they did reach something that they believed was the boulder, but they couldn't really verify that. And eventually they sell their platform to hippies and they let the claim lapse.
And that's the end of it. The hippies are floating around on the lake and they move on.
Well, in the 1980s, a couple of other guys stake claims in the area where they think the boulder is. But rather than go after it themselves, they hold a diving contest. And they promise the finder 10%. And the divers also have to pay a $50 entrance fee.
Like scuba divers.
Yeah, exactly. The day of the contest arrives and 4 divers show up.
Just 4.
Just 4. Outnumbered 5-1 by the TV crews. And they find nothing.
Nothing.
So a couple years later, another guy who claims to be a dowser goes looking. But he also comes up empty-handed.
What's a dowser?
It's, one of those guys who've got metal rods who claims that he can find stuff.
So we'll really never know if there's a gold boulder down at the bottom of Kootenay Lake.
Well, there is someone I want you to meet. His name is Hank Pronk. He's from Fairmont in the East Kootenay. And in his shop, he has built 8 submarines.
You're kidding me.
You heard me right. 8 homemade submarines. All hand-built by a true Kootenay original. Hank Pronk is a self-taught submarine maker. Listen as he sinks down into Premier Lake next to the Rockies in his sub. This is a test run for him.
12 feet from the bottom. 5 feet from the bottom, and I can see it now, so I have 5 to 6 feet of visibility.
At 16, I just thought it'd be really cool to have a submarine. I mean, what do you know at 16? The problem is, a guy my age, we didn't have internet and all the nice things that go with that. So I really didn't get going with submarines until the internet came along, and then I could educate myself. And that's how I was able to have enough knowledge to build a 3,000-foot rated submarine, which is the deepest rated home-built submarine in the world. There's no home-built submarine that'll dive 3,000 feet, other than this one.
Okay, we're coming up to the surface now. The sub is nice and level, 34 feet off the bottom.
Okay, so I can tell where this is going. I think Hank Pronk is taking that homemade sub down to look for the gold boulder, isn't he?
Yes, he is. Hank is on his way down this summer, and he claims he's going to prove or disprove the existence of that gold boulder once and for all.
Does he get to keep it if he finds it?
Well, probably. But, diving that deep in water as cold as Kootenay Lake has always been the problem, even for professional divers. But Hank has his sub, and he has headed down to find the boulder.
I mean, there's different versions of the story. I have no idea if it's true or not. But, if you have a submarine, you really should have a look for it, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to look for the boat that sank when they dropped the gold boulder into it. If we can find that boat, then we've got something to do. If we can't find the boat, there's no point. So that's why we got a side scan sonar.
But do you believe the gold boulder even exists?
Have you ever noticed that every train and every boat that ever sank had gold and whiskey on it? Seems kind of funny to me.
That's hilarious. What a classic Kootenay tale. He's taking his homemade sub down to find a boulder of gold he's skeptical about.
It just enhances our tall tale. Hank is going to put it to rest once and for all with his sub. Or is he? Randall Kemp, the guy that came up with this story, is having the last laugh.
Why is our tall tale teller having the last laugh?
He would never have believed that nearly 130 years later, people would be taking him seriously and still looking for the boulder.
Greg Nesteroff with some local lore. I hope Hank Pronk finds the famed gold boulder. I can only imagine the sub upgrades he could make with all that dough. Now for a more recent tall tale. A Kootenay original that went around the world about a decade ago, yet has never been told from beginning to end. Until now. Here's Graham Tracy with the story of the cheetah in the snow.
Can we show them how your little pink nose? Oh my God, you're cute.
That's Robin right there. You see his eyes are black. Cheetah eyes are normally orange. He had a virus that destroyed the signals to his eyes, so unfortunately he was mostly blind.
Oh, and of course this is...
Videos and memories are all Earl Pfeiffer has left of his 2 African cheetahs, Annie and Robin. His beloved pets are on the other side of the country in a roadside zoo. Pfeiffer lives alone in Creston, despite spending over $1 million and a decade of his life trying to keep his cheetahs in the Kootenays. A fight, he says, depleted his savings and robbed him of his health. Yet, it's a fight Earl Pfeiffer does not regret.
I mean, if I said to you, what's the most important thing you've done in your life? How many people have done something that took a risk? How many people have gone out and done something strong? How many people have tried to do something that changed things, that made a difference?
Remember when a cougar was only a wild, snarling beast? The symbol of a small, sporty car.
Earl Pfeiffer's love of animals goes back to when he was a kid in the 1970s. His family owned the local Ford dealership, and as part of a promotion, the company sent them a cougar cub, which Earl took care of.
I had to look after a cougar once when I was younger, and it really left an impression on me. You ask people to think back about remarkable moments in their life. Quite often, it'll be a moment with an animal.
At the sign of the cat.
Pfeiffer traveled the world as an adult, seeking out experiences with wild animals. Sharks and big cats were his favorites, and he developed a love of cheetahs. He settled in New Zealand with his wife, Carol.
We went to New Zealand. That was the first time I had a one-on-one interaction with cheetahs. There was a breeding facility there, and we spent 2 years traveling everywhere that had cheetahs that would let us in the door to see cheetahs and work with them. They love being around people. They're just incredibly adorable animals. They're not the wild animal people think they are.
Pfeiffer did well in New Zealand, acquiring the rights to Subway franchises, opening more than 100 stores. The couple decided to return home to Canada and search the world for cheetahs to buy as pets.
Well, we spent 2 years doing it. We found a place in Ontario that had a zoo license that would buy them and then sell them to us. And we had made friends with the breeder in South Africa, which was absolutely necessary to get the cheetahs. And all in all, it took us 2 years fighting the federal government and all the other governments who really didn't want to give us the cheetahs, but the law wasn't in their favor. So in the end, 11 o'clock at night at Toronto Airport, we picked up 2 cheetahs.
Say hi to everybody. Just look around. Get to see what's going on. Robbie's just looking over there watching the bears.
Initially, the couple kept their 2 cheetahs in a zoo in Ontario, then Alberta. Both provinces had lax exotic animal rules. The plan was to bring the cheetahs home to BC, where they owned properties in Crawford Bay and Caslow. They built a specially designed cheetah enclosure and hoped their exotic pets would become ambassadors to sow seeds of conservation and preserve the species.
We lived out in the middle of nowhere in Caslow, so in the entire time we were there, nobody knew we had them. We just load them up in a Jeep and take them out in the woods and spend the day with them type of thing.
Pfeiffer kept applying to the BC government to legally keep his pets and kept getting turned down. In 2007, a woman was mauled to death by a tiger at a roadside zoo in Williams Lake. BC developed some of the strictest exotic pet laws in the country, and the cheetahs would have to go. But the couple kept them, knowing they were breaking the law, reasoning no one was being harmed as long as their cheetahs were looked after. They even fitted them with GPS collars for those walks in the woods. Then one day, almost 8 years ago, one escaped.
It was in the winter and there was deep snow, and Carol was reading a book, I think, and the 2 cheetahs were lying down taking a nap, and Carol looked up and Annie was gone. And of course she had spotted a deer and took off after it, and found out very quickly that cheetahs aren't very good at chasing deer in deep snow. So by the time that photograph happened, she was exhausted on the side of the road and wondering what to do.
It was a photograph that would end Earl Pfeiffer's cheetah journey, cost him over $1 million, and send him to the hospital from the stress of it all. A picture of a cheetah in the snow.
I think I was going to the store, and as I turned a corner and started going up the hill, I saw a wild animal on the side of the road. I guess I instinctively knew it was a cat, possibly by the shape of the tail.
Samantha Iston spotted the cheetah on a routine trip to get groceries. She says it was one of the strangest things she'd ever seen, a fully grown African cheetah loping down the highway after a winter storm.
My thought was to get it in the back of the car and then try and find out where it came from. But I wasn't scared. And the cheetah didn't seem to be scared of me either. At any rate, I started trying to coax it over while I was snapping pictures with my camera.
Istons could not get the cheetah to come to her and carried on to the Crawford Bay store with the strange pictures on her phone.
I burst into the store and said, "You'll never guess what I just saw on the side of the road. I just saw a cheetah." So everybody gathered around with me, and I pulled the pictures up on my phone, and there was lots of gasps and, "Wow, that's amazing," that sort of stuff.
Word of the cheetah in the snow ripped through Crawford Bay like a puppy through a daycare. A reporter at the local paper asked if she could put a shot online, and Istons agreed. But in the world of instant communication, there is no such thing as local news anymore.
I started getting phone calls from people at various news agencies, CBC, news agencies from European countries, from Africa, and I eventually just shut off my phone.
The slightly blurry shot of a cheetah on a snowy Canadian road looking toward the photographer went around the world instantly.
The mystery of how a cheetah came to be walking along a BC highway in the snow may never be solved. A photo of the cat went viral.
This photo snapped as the cat walked along the highway in Crawford Bay. Parents
It all started with a picture that resulted in far more than 1,000 words. The photo is of an...
First thing I heard about it was a brother called me from Costa Rica and says, "Do you know you're on the front page of MSN?" And I said, "What?" And that was less than 3 hours after the event happened.
Earl and Carol panicked. They say Annie had returned an hour after the picture was snapped, but there was mayhem in Crawford Bay. Parents were told to keep their kids indoors and walk them to school. Conservation officers were dispatched to track the cheetah in a snowstorm. Rather than fess up it was one of their illegal cheetahs, Earl and Carol bolted with the two animals, just ahead of the Conservation Service.
It was just an absurd, surreal experience, watching this sort of calamity go on, and such a mess, you know. We were in deep trouble. Just an absolute disaster. So we took them straight back to Ontario, to the place where we had them before. But that was it. The damage was done.
The couple were charged with possessing an alien species without a permit, and Earl Pfeiffer geared up for a fight. But after a year or so, the charges were quietly dropped. The province said it lacked evidence. Emboldened, Pfeiffer decided he would appeal the BC government's decision not to give them a permit to begin with. But he says his wife Carol was having none of it.
Yeah, it ended a relationship, yeah. My wife was perfectly content to just have them as pets in Ontario, and that's all she wanted to do. And I was very much stuck on trying to get the permits and being able to do something positive with the animals so that people could see them. Yeah, and it ended up separating us.
Earl carried on with his expensive fight alone, hiring a lawyer, putting together documents for a week-long hearing in Nelson.
Mr. Pfeiffer has invested a great deal of money into designing an enclosure that exceeds requirements. That is, and will demonstrate through evidence that is in excess of what's required to contain the cheetah.
It was a fight he was never going to win. The province threw everything they had at him.
The appeal that we went through in Nelson was a foregone conclusion. They had experts from Africa. They had experts from the States. The Minister of Wildlife came herself and spent 5 days there, along with lawyers, and just ground us into the ground.
Give her a good scratch, and she can lean on my knee.
Almost 8 years after the photo was taken, Earl Pfeiffer has his videos, but not his cats. He lost the case and his pets. His health is failing. His savings were poured into the failed effort to keep his cheetahs. He doesn't see the animals or talk to his ex-wife. Some might consider it a sad ending to the strange tale of the cheetah in the snow. Earl doesn't.
I did something I felt was important. I did something that was a risk. If it sounds sad, I think sad is not doing anything. When you're in your last days and you're lying in bed and you look back, you want to say you did everything you could in your life? I don't have any regrets. If I got hit by a car tomorrow, I had a good life.
Say hi to everybody.
Thank you, Graham, for that remarkable story. We'll end with the tale of Lou Gagnon, a dreamer, an inventor, a miner, a guy who drifted to Rossland at the end of the 19th century and got straight to work.
Lou Gagnon, like many other people, searching for new frontiers, searching for better things, and a bit of an inventor and a tinkerer, always coming up with a new idea for things. And one time he came up with a real doozy.
Storyteller Carolyn McTaggart has a tall tale. Some believe, some don't. If it's true, we're going to have to rewrite the history books because of Gagnon's clanging around a shop in Rossland and what he eventually came up with.
He didn't tell anybody about what he was doing. He locked himself inside the shed next to the hotel that we know today as the Flying Steam Shovel. And he started tinkering, and nobody knew what he was up to, and he wasn't talking, except that there was a lot of banging and a lot of sound and welding and sorts of things. And all he would say is that he had this amazing idea for how to get the ore from the mountains down to the processing stations. And one day, he announced that he was ready. And he opened up the doors to the shed, and at this point, everybody in the town was just buzzing about what the heck Mr. Gagnon was up to. So quite the crowd had gathered outside the hotel. And he rolled this contraption out, and it essentially was what we would recognize nowadays as a helicopter. Here was iron, wood, brass, canvas, piano wire, who knows what else. They were looking at it thinking like, yeah, I don't know if that thing's going to do anything at all. But Gagnon fired up those steam engines, and the rotor started turning, the propeller started turning. That rather rickety structure was shuddering away. It started to rise in the air and take flight. You have to remember, this was 2 years before the Wright brothers and Kitty Hawk, right? So, this was really something. And they say that he went up at least as high as the hotel next door. And unfortunately, the flight itself only lasted for a few seconds, maybe 5 or 6. The engines couldn't handle it, and the whole thing started to come apart. He got off pretty lucky. When the helicopter crashed, a couple of local firefighters were able to pull him from the wreckage. He was pretty badly battered, but got away with some burns and a broken leg and survived to tell the tale. After that, he decided to maybe take a little break on inventing and ended up moving to Spokane, where he took up haberdashery, of all things, and that seemed to suit him pretty well. The question remains, on that day in 1902, did Lou Gagnon invent the helicopter and become one of the first humans to take flight? Or is this just another tall tale of the Kootenays?
And that's our podcast, brought to you by Columbia Basin Trust. You can learn more about the marvelous work they do at ourtrust.org. Thanks to our two reporters, Graham Tracy and Greg Nestoroff. You can see more on those two stories and others at headwaterspodcast.com. I'm Mitchell Scott. Thanks for listening.